Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington. President Obama hosted 46 world leaders who came to discuss ways to slow down nuclear weapon proliferation, also to try to speed up nuclear disarmament, and to help us assess the success or failure of that conference. We're now joined by Jonathan Schell. Jonathan's an author. He teaches at Yale. He's written extensively on the question of nuclear weapons. He's also a board member of the Real News Network, and he has a new piece in The Nation. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Good to be with you, Paul.
So first of all, start with the conference. Did something substantive come out of it? There was a lot of good words. We hear about a nuclear spring, which I suppose means something to do with a thaw.
Well, I think that nuclear spring phrase is a little bit troublesome. It's interesting. It's by analogy to the Prague Spring, because when President Obama went to Prague last April and committed the United States to arriving at a world free of nuclear weapons, he likened the kind of effort and movement that would be required to make that happen with the Prague Spring, which had so much to do with the end of the Cold War and the downfall of the Soviet Union. Of course, the problem there is if you say Prague Spring, that meant the movement against the Soviet rule. If you say nuclear spring, it sounds like nuclear weapons are pepping up again. I immediately thought of that show that was put on in the movie The Producers, Springtime for Hitler in Germany. But I do appreciate the idea, and I do appreciate the analogy, but maybe they need to go back to the wordsmith shop.
Was the conference, though, something substantive? There was a lot of talk how this had been a success for Obama.
Well, I think that the things that were done in the conference, or that were promised to be more exact, were good things, important things, because the world is awash in highly enriched uranium that was sent out really from the Eisenhower administration on by both the Soviet Union and the United States for research reactors around the world. And of course, it's very dangerous for proliferation purposes to have that about if some unauthorized group, a terrorist group, would get hold of it. So it makes sense to lock it down, to consolidate it, and promises were made on that score. Of course, the conference actually was probably not the most important thing in the nuclear arena. I have to say that one thing to give Obama real credit, he's put the nuclear question back on the agenda in a big way. And all the nuclear pots are boiling. It's really quite remarkable what's going on. I mean, there was first his Prague speech and the commitment to a nuclear weapon-free world, which was a great thing in my opinion. And then we had the so-called New START agreement, which was a new agreement between Russia and the United States, cutting back on arsenals just a little, but cutting them back. Then really very important, and I hope we'll talk about it, is the Nuclear Posture Review, which sets forth the deployments and rationale for those deployments of American nuclear forces in the world under the Obama administration. And then came the summit, the Nuclear Security Summit, so-called, that you mentioned. And coming up soon, as if all this weren't enough, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, the 5-yearly review.
The agreement between the Russians and the Americans to reduce their numbers of arms, of nuclear weapons, it seems to presuppose that they still need them. We're still talking about more than 1,000 weapons each. It presupposes that if there was an imbalance, one might use them. It presupposes that the potential of war is still there. The number of weapons China still has, and it seems like the nuclear thinking is still very rooted in the 20th century.
You know, there are two ways to look at that agreement. Number one is that they've reduced the limits on each side by about a third. It doesn't actually add up to a 1/3 cut, but we don't need to go into that. But a couple of hundred weapons down on each side, and of course that's all to the good. Probably more important is that they revived the inspection system, which the Bush administration let lapse, so it signals a kind of serious intention about nuclear arms control. But the other way to look at it is to look at what's left. And what is truly shocking to me is that 20 years after the end of the Cold War, we'll be aiming 1,550 nuclear warheads at Russia and facing an equal number aimed at us in return. This sort of strategic standoff, rationalized or justified by the hoary old mutual assured destruction deterrence doctrine, seems to have been given an immunity from any global changes, including the geopolitical revolution that occurred 20 years ago with the end of the Cold War and fall of the Soviet Union.
The fundamental psychology doesn't seem to have changed in terms of the idea of the Grand Chessboard, the way Brzezinski painted it in his book, which is the competition between the big powers, and seems to be, in their mindset at least, they being both the foreign policy military thinkers in the United States, Russia, and China, who are all of them spending tons of money on arms that would only be used against another big power. There's a difference in the kind of, obviously, the arms they might use to suppress internal dissent or other kinds of fighting at that level. But all the big powers are still spending a lot of money on the potential of fighting each other. And in fact, in the 20th century, the big wars were primarily wars amongst capitalist powers. It really wasn't about capitalism versus socialism, even though that's supposed to be what the Cold War was about. So, that thinking, does it perhaps reflect a reality that these guys are serious about the possibility of war with each other?
This is where it gets hard to interpret, because, every 10 minutes, everyone says that the Cold War is over. They speak as if there could be no possibility of a nuclear war, even a conventional war with Russia, in spite of tensions and jockeying and sort of traditional great power issues. But there's another question here that is very, very basic and that rarely gets an airing. Let's suppose that we are heading into an era where there are great power tensions of a kind of 19th or 20th or early 20th century type. The issue then is, do we want those to be nuclearized, so to speak? Do we want those to be nuclear-armed confrontations? Or is it conceivable that it would be better to have those tensions, as I think, without having nuclear arms in the background? When Obama talks about a world without nuclear weapons, although he does quickly add, maybe not in his lifetime, unfortunately, is he imagining a world without any great power tensions, or are we imagining a world that has those, but that is just not armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons?
Well, if you look at the way the American foreign policy establishment talks and writes, they seem to take the geopolitical struggle amongst the big powers with great seriousness. If you look at the way McCain ran in the last election, if he'd been president right now, it's every reason to think we could be having a confrontation with Russia over Georgia. Certainly he was making Russia the theater, his theater of operations, rather than Afghanistan, where he put all the focus. The idea that Americans would put anti-missile systems, which George Bush wanted to do in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and Hungary. All the machinations feel like about the old encirclement of Russia. Before we talk about whether it should be nuclear or not, this seems to be kind of these two parallel worlds we live in. One, Obama's talking about let's have no nuclear weapons, but over here, they seem to be making all the old chessboard moves.
Back in the 19th century, it was really possible that, and it happened, that these great powers were going to go to war. That's what occurred in 1914 and again in 1945. But now we live in a nuclear-armed world and a nuclear-capable world. So if you're speaking of great power rivalries, you have to take that into account. And the judgment has been, during the Cold War, that really you couldn't fight great power wars anymore because nuclear weapons would be brought into play and everybody would be blown up. And by the way, that remains the case even if you get rid of the hardware and move to the abolition of the nuclear hardware, because that knowledge remains in the world. And so that sort of veto effect of nuclear weapons on great power war is with us forever. So I don't think you can speak realistically about a full-scale revival of those old tensions and rivalries, which twice led to World War, because I don't think it can happen that way now because of the once nuclear weapons were born into the world.
So what do you make then of this argument about whether these tensions should be nuclearized or not? Because there is an argument that if they're nuclearized, there's less likelihood of all-out war, all-out big power war.
Even if you get rid of the hardware, that potential for rebuilding nuclear weapons always stands guard over the world in a certain sense. Whatever tensions or rivalries go on in the world between big powers or between big powers and little ones, it has to be without the actual nuclear hardware in place. Because right now we're heading into a world in which proliferation, if we don't check it, is going to go unchecked, and we have now 9 nuclear powers. We might end up with 15, 20, and that's an anarchic nuclear world, and one that's just going to be most extremely dangerous for everybody.
Okay, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about Iran and what this conference that was held in Washington has to do with the isolation of Iran, and the whole question of when do nations have rights to nuclear weapons, and why do some seem to have those rights and others don't. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Jonathan Schell.